Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Digital Difference with me, Scott Gulliver, and Oliver Moradi.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, episode 20, which is a nice milestone for us to hit. And we're pretty pleased to have been going this long, which is great. And today, Ollie, we wanted to talk all about budget, scope, essentially delivering projects within constraints, right? Which is, I guess, at the moment, pretty topical. I mean, there's always constraints, aren't there? But I would assume at the moment, with financial pressures and time to get things to market and everything else, there's a lot more constraints than there ever were.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting conversation that we can have today about it, actually, because like you just said, post-pandemic, budget has been a massive issue in every business. So how are companies dealing with that? But equally, at the same time, it's not a new issue at all. Like pre-pandemic as well, it was still an issue. I just think that post-pandemic has actually just given companies an excuses to kind of say, no, we're really tight on budget. We can't pay this, we can't pay that. So it's actually given them that extra leverage, if you will, with different projects and stuff like that. So I think it's quite interesting how we can kind of explore that today.
Yeah, it's certainly always been about, hasn't it? And I think actually in some ways now it's been pretty useful for companies to actually have a bit of a closer look at their bottom line and what they're spending on projects and actually what they're going to get out of the back of it. Because I think, especially with the software world, a lot of projects get started, but no one really keeps an eye on the end return. And actually this time has kind of forced companies to look a bit more at what they're going to get back, which is hopefully useful. But of course, that has ended up with a lot of budgets being cut in many places in many projects. So who knows about long term for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an interesting time because I think in some places there will be budget cuts, but in other places there will be, especially within software. I mean, I know you just said software, there's a lot of budget cuts, but equally there's probably going to be a lot of money thrown into those areas, especially to kind of develop that digital transformation. At the moment, there needs to be a massive need for digital transformation in every business because of the pandemic and how much people are relying on digital. So with that, it's that whole thing about supply and demand. There's a massive demand for digital at the moment, so there's going to be a big supply, and that's where the money's going to go. So it's interesting for online. It's interesting for tech and devs and web, but for other projects, I can imagine it's actually very difficult, especially people coming back on the budget and taking that budget away to put into things like digital.
Yeah. And I think budget is one of the larger constraints and probably the more obvious ones that we see a lot in projects. But I wondered if we might start on the other end, which I think is a constraint that's actually often thrown at the teams doing the work, but perhaps without much thought as to why. And that's time constraints or timeline constraints. What's been your experience, Ollie, with kind of time constraints on projects? Because I know a lot of deadlines are thrown around, and a lot of the time I'm not quite sure there are good reasons behind them necessarily.
No, and I don't think there's enough research into it beforehand. So I think a lot of the time a project will give a time restraint purely based on what other companies are doing, or maybe a bit of research into another company and how they've delivered it. And they say, well, that's the standard. So, we're going to go with that standard and we need to deliver this in 3 months. And that's basically my experience. And to be quite honest with you, I think that every single project has to have a bespoke time frame. Has to have a time frame that's made for it personally. And it's all about delivering the right service and all delivering the right product in the end of the day, and that has to take a certain amount of time. So I think the time frame should really be understood up front, bespoke to whatever you're building or whatever your service is. Personally, from the learning background, and especially within structural design, we're given usually around a 3-month window, and I think that's for all instructional designers really across all businesses. The average is about 3 months to build. And again, I'm going back to this, I don't think it's right, because sometimes you can build something that's really simple and easy and you've been given 3 months and you completed the project within a month and you've got 2 months left to do nothing. Or and this is obviously where Agile comes in to play, and you can start working on other things and helping out other teams. But or you get given a massive project, and equally you get given that 3 months and you're rushing to deliver something, and then you come out with that whole 80% of something is better than 100% of nothing. And there's that whole approach. And for me, my experience is, I think that I think that people rely on too many averages and just kind of decide a time frame up front based on what other people are doing instead of actually doing some proper research into it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And from my experience, I've seen certainly a lot of larger companies and maybe more established companies operate in that way. And I think quite often that can be drilled down to a disconnect between those that are perhaps planning the wider work, whether it's a PMO, a kind of a PMO office, or something similar, even a board level. To be honest, it could be driven by a disconnect between that and the actual work being done. And they want, at that level, when there's so many layers in between, you almost want a model that's nice and easy to replicate over coming quarters or years or however long into the future and kind of project it. But you're right. I mean, ultimately, projects, especially these days, and with the changes we've seen in the landscape over the past 12 months, I think it's really important to get an idea of where you're delivering this in the market and how that might impact it. Because certainly in the startup world, it's kind of the other end where there are real drivers behind getting something launched in time, whether that be because there's only so much runway in terms of finance and you suddenly need some profit back, or whether it's just because you want to hit the market before either the competition does or before the market dries up, potentially, if you're hitting a small little piece of the overall pie. So there are certainly market constraints. But yeah, I mean, apart from those, I think you're right in the fact that timelines can often be a bit contrived, a bit invented a lot of the time. The other thing that I think can drive timelines a lot is, or certainly put pressure on timelines, is when things start going bad, with air quotes, for a project. And again, I think a lot of the time it's unfortunate because as we've just discussed, timelines can quite often be invented, and then it's all hands to the deck to try and get things delivered to this almost imaginary point in time. I mean, what's your experience of that?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the time, I think that's more of a panic more than anything else when that happens. It gets to a later stage where projects start panicking that they're not going to deliver in time, or they're not going to get something done in time. So it happens later on in the stage. So they start throwing money at it where they don't have money, and they go out to the funding board or what have you and request extra resource because they've already put millions into it and it's not going to be delivered on time. So for me, that I've seen that where they get that sort of that resource elsewhere and they throw loads of money at it. And I think it's just a reaction. I think that it can actually be avoided with proper planning. And I think this is where Agile comes in.
I think one of the other things with timelines as well is that there can be often an increase in the pressure to deliver something if there's maybe a new team or a new hire that's been made, especially at a senior level or at a project management level, that can want to maybe deliver results. I mean, have you seen that before, Ollie?
Definitely. And you see it more and more with contractors more than anything else. I think that any new contractor who comes into the business really needs to prove themselves immediately. So they may try and take on stuff that A, they don't have the skill set to do, to try and get things done quickly, and or B, put a lot of pressure on teams within the business that are already there to try and deliver something really quickly. And quite often, because the teams aren't used to working the way that they're used to working, because again, the contractor probably doesn't have the skill set that they're trying to do. So they've probably come in as a project manager, but they're trying to also do the build as well themselves, just to try and deliver something really quickly. Half the time you get maybe half a product or half a service that you don't want. And I've only very rarely seen it become successful a few times and actually pay off. Most of the time I've actually just seen that contractor get a bad rep within a company. Equally with, I mean, when it's a permie, it's obviously they come in and they try and take that position of, I want to deliver something amazing and deliver something quickly. And they usually find it early on, but because the business always has a slower approach, they don't expect a permanent person to come in and sort of hit the ground running. That person really wants to do something, but they kind of get caught up in that slow progression, if you will, of getting into the role, whereas a contractor is expected to come in and hit the ground running. So I think I do see that quite a lot, and I think it's 50-50, and it's very, very dependent on who you bring in.
I definitely agree. I mean, certainly it's pretty frustrating when people come in and try to do something that they can't, just because of the inflated pressure. I think though that it can be a really useful thing, and especially when the person coming in is a good leader, because what it can do is be a real opportunity to almost bring a bit of fire underneath the team, especially one that's been around for a while, and especially if it's a hire that's being made to bring some transformation or energy into the organization. Then I think if that person does it right and brings the whole team along for the ride, it can be a really powerful time to deliver something quickly and effectively. But yeah, ultimately they need to lead well as well on that, because not to suffer things like burnout in the long term and all those sorts of things. It's important to make sure that the team's managed well, but can be really useful. I just think it's another one of those times when another one of those big factors when timelines can be suddenly kind of thrown into awry. So yeah, it's an interesting one for sure.
I think it's quite interesting how you've gone with that approach from the different angle of actually it can set a fire under the team that's already there and kind of get them going. Whereas for me, my personal experience is more it's either a hit or a miss kind of thing. So yeah, it's quite interesting how you've seen it from that perspective, being a contractor yourself more recently, and me coming from a permanent background. So it's quite interesting to see the different sorts of views from that.
Yeah, new person aside, I think it's actually one of the real ways you can help to reduce some of the time against the timeline, which is just to start to rally the team around it. I mean, this is only something you can play a few times, I think, in a row, because you do start leaning towards things like burnout, where teams just can't take that extra pressure for a long period of time. But certainly, if it's a really important deadline and you've made that deadline clear to the people who are delivering it, and not just when those dates are, but as to why we're doing this, if you can get some purpose behind the team and really inject them with some importance behind the date, then it could be a great way to get them motivated to help deliver. And of course, that's only going to stretch very far. You can't expect teams to deliver the world for nothing. But ultimately, bringing that why and some of that energy yourself and leading can be a really great way of just helping people to meet those deadlines, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. How have you found that budget changes scope generally?
Budget hopefully is one of those things that's set from the off, right? So whether it be determined from the return on investment that someone thinks they're going to get, or maybe it's because they've gone out to get external funding for something and they've got a set budget from that point of view. But I think it is important to know the budget, first of all, before you go into a project. I mean, ultimately, in terms of how it affects scope, you mentioned Agile earlier, of course. This is a great way of balancing a set of features or a wish list of scope, essentially, against the budget. And for those, I mean, that aren't familiar with scope and those sorts of terms, by scope work, I think we're talking about the number of features, essentially, aren't we? Or the size of delivery, effectively.
Yeah.
And I think, as we've discussed in previous episodes, figuring out what your minimum viable product is and what your absolute must-have features are, and then prioritizing everything else in a nice order. I think that's a great way to then essentially allow the scope to dictate how much time you have, and then essentially run down that list and hopefully get as far as you can down that list. And prioritizing it with something like, must have, should have, and want to have, or desirable is a great way of doing that, and just prioritizing those features. And again, it makes it clear to those who are delivering it as well that this is kind of the minimum of what we need to deliver, and anything else is an absolute bonus, which is great.
I found that it changes it massively, obviously.
Yeah.
If we're gonna say it from a simple term, yeah, it definitely changes it hugely. And I think that it's a very important factor up front to understand what you're going to deliver. So within that scope, like what you actually are going to deliver based on the budget. Because obviously there's a huge difference between what you're going to get for £2.50 compared to what you're going to get for 2 million. I found a lot of the time that I work under budget, so there's always that challenge with budget. I find that that it's always sort of a scramble to get money within a project and trying to get as much as we can out of the funding board just to deliver one thing. So personally, I've always worked to a challenge with budget. I don't ever think that I've ever been given a massive abundance of money to go out and make something, and I don't think that's usually how it works. But equally, that is something that I kind of would like to know if you've got any experience of. Have you ever worked on a project, Scott, where because I personally haven't, but where you've been given a massive amount of money to kind of go out and deliver something? Or do you think it's always the case of budget's always one of those things that's just going to kind of creep and you're never going to actually get the ideal budget that you want to deliver the ideal product or service?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I don't think I've ever been involved in a project where there's been an abundance of money at the end. And I would suggest as well that if that's the case, there's also something that's gone wrong there, right?
Yeah.
I think you're right there. There is often an imbalance, and I think hopefully that's being addressed somewhat with Agile when it's done properly. But with those larger projects, normally comes a lot more upfront investment in terms of the research, which is fantastic. But then there's those are where I so often see the kind of purse strings being loosened a little bit in the hope that things will pick up later. And of course, there are creative ways of doing that, but not, not very far. And ultimately, I think as well that there's the old kind of project management triangle, isn't there, where you can basically pick two of it being fast, good, or cheap. And I think a lot of the time companies want all of those, and as we know, that's not really viable. But certainly, budget is one of the more constrained options. And I think as well, just because of how companies run, whether you're a scrappy startup and you're looking from external investment, quite often you are limited by the amount of cash that's there, quite physically. And then for large companies, there's often so many gateways between actually getting kind of concepting a project and then getting the budget for it, that it needs to go through such a process to determine what that budget is to begin with. And it's a great place to start. But yeah, I can't say I've been involved where there's been an abundance of money. But I think thankfully we're getting more and more tools and more ways of working that help to balance some of that, like you've said with Agile and other things.
Yeah. And I think like we've covered before, I think the only time that you actually see that budget come in is when the project's under a lot of pressure against maybe a time frame, for instance, and the delivery. And that's when all of a sudden the purse strings loosen a bit, like you say, and they start coming out, and the money starts coming out, and you start getting given the resource that you actually finally need. And I think that also, if we talk about that, that's kind of a lot of a problem that I find with projects. It's never considered up front, especially within budget, as to how to deliver something. It's always on the hope that you can deliver something with a certain amount of resource, even though the project's probably telling you, or the consultants or whoever are within projects or the analysts are saying to you, you're going to need more resource. There's always that hope from the project managers, I find, that they are going to be able to deliver on less resource than they think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's not hard to see why, right? Because ultimately a business is there to make money, and the more they can bring down the costs and hopefully still get the same return, then the better. I think the expectation is though that return will still be the same even if they dial down the costs. And again, that only goes so far, doesn't it? And I think it's worth, just because we touched on a few of them, but you talked about how you can kind of release some budget to help get to meet a timeline or a deadline that's been introduced. I think we've kind of danced around a few, because I think there are other ways to do it as well. We obviously talked about kind of rallying the team and hopefully putting some energy within the team for the same resource. That's probably one way. Scope is the other way, of course. And I think that's probably the more obvious way for a lot of companies to start, or a lot of products to actually meet their budgets initially, is to, again, have a very good idea of what's definitely required and what's really a nice to have. And I think those nice to haves can be pretty hard for some companies to let go. But when you start to really break down who you're aiming your product at, those nice to haves hopefully become things that you can cut without too much loss. And of course, like you said as well, the resources. And again, I don't know what you think about this, but there's a certain expectation that you can kind of throw more bodies at the problem and it will get solved quicker. But of course, we know that's not totally the case in all instances, right?
I think it's about getting the right bodies, personally, from my experience.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think a lot of the time you can throw as many bodies as you can, but if they're late into the project, there's always going to be that thing where you have to take time to actually get them on board and get them up to speed. And then let's be honest, there's the factor of whether they're good or not at their job. Half the time, with contractors, it's very much of a risk, especially if you're bringing in new contractors or contractors you can't you don't know. So you don't have that, you haven't built that level of trust with them yet, or you don't have you don't know what their experience is. You've just brought them in, and you don't know whether they can actually deliver or not, and then you've lost out on both on both the product you're trying to produce and on budget as well. So you've lost out on two factors there. So again, this is where I go back to, if it's me, it's being really honest up front about what you're going to need in terms of your scope, and being really like you said before, Scott, like being really detailed up front about how you're going to deliver it, and how you're going to deliver within the scope and what resource you're going to need. If you try and undercut it in any way to try and, I don't know, impress your managers or whoever it is you're trying to say to kind of save money, it 9 out of 10 times it doesn't work, and you end up spending so much money. And I've seen it so many times where the project actually doesn't end up delivering because, or the product doesn't go out, it gets canned, and they've spent millions on it because they just undercut it, and it's just poor project management. So for me, I think that it's just being truthful up front about what can be delivered within that scope and within the budget.
Yeah, project management's a really interesting one that I want to come back to in a minute. But I think that's a really good point you made about the fact that it's not good for anyone working to a very, very tight budget. I think ultimately there's a certain case as well that for a team working to a very large set of features or kind of wish list of features, and with very little budget, and just knowing in the back of their minds, even if they're getting paid their salaries and everything else, just working in a team that you're making something for very little overhead for the company, that's almost being seen as something that's not worth spending the money on. It's not a great motivator, and that there is always a case to kind of put a bit of effort into just promoting this project and making it a success, like you say. I mean, the amount of projects that get canned is crazy, and thankfully, again, we've got more tools now with Agile and everything to hopefully reduce some of that. But even so, it's really helpful if you can motivate the team, and a great way to do that is to really hold this project up as something that you value as a company.
Yeah, exactly. And when you value something, you put money in it. I couldn't agree more. In fact, I have never actually thought about it, but from that side of things. But maybe that is actually an influence for me as well. When I'm working on something and I know that there's not a lot of budget to it, and it's something that not many people are going to see, and they're not that bothered by it, but they still want it to be built. You're not that bothered about it really, but when it's like kind of that high profile, big budget, and I know we're basing stuff on how much budget you're going to get given now, but it isn't just that. It's about the importance of that. And if it's given, not just budget, let's talk about scope as well. If it's given, say, on average I get 3 months, but if someone gives me 6 months and say we want you to build something amazing, even if it was for the same budget, straight away I know that this is something of high value, and this is something of high importance. So you get that motivation behind you to go out and build something incredible, and it's going to get that sort of feel. So yeah, absolutely, I think that is definitely a driver within team, basically, to try and actually deliver something good, deliver a good product.
Yeah, totally. And you mentioned project management obviously being a huge factor in the kind of scope question. What's been your experience of that, Gerald? I mean, how important of a role do they play?
Very important. And I think the problem is that I think they've almost got too much say over the scope. And this kind of goes back to your sort of disconnect from the actual boots on the ground, if you will. A lot of the time project managers come in because, they're just free. They're a free resource at the time. They may not have any experience in what you do. They may be a project manager in some other field completely, but they've been brought in because everybody seems to think that project managers can work in every field. I completely disagree with that. I think that if you have a project manager, you need to have that project manager understanding exactly what, for instance, we work within digital transformation. You need to have a digital project manager at least when they're approaching this, because any project manager can't. Quite frankly, I'd be very worried if someone came to me and said, "Oh, we brought you a project manager. They've been the project manager for skincare in Boots or something like that for the last 3 years." It would worry me because they have no idea what it is to deliver digital products. And I think that this is the problem, and it's an oversight massively from a lot of businesses, that just project manager means that they can project manage anything, and they can't. It's a very specialist role. And I think that this is where that, like you've mentioned before, this is where that disconnect comes in. So they'll come in and they'll agree a scope and they'll agree a budget, and they won't listen to the boots on the ground. And immediately, again, it's a demotivator. Immediately the team's going to go, no, we're not going to be able to deliver this, or, well, you have to, it's been agreed now. Straight away, it's going to be like, well, we can do the best we can, but we know this isn't going to be what it could be. And I think that immediately, always in every single project is, I've seen it in quite a few projects as well. I think it's almost an immediately the motivator, if you will. and it just kind of, it takes away that that realistic approach to any projects. And then later down the line, as we can all guess, the project has to throw more money at it, more bodies come in, and it's just not the project that you've planned. So yeah, absolutely, I've seen it all the time. I mean, what about you, Scott? Do you see that often, or do you feel like there's a lot of project managers out there that just kind of switch and change roles?
Yeah, I can't see I've seen too much of that, but I've certainly heard of it in the industry. And I think you're right. I mean, I'm speaking a bit out of my expertise here, but from my experience of it, there's a certain level of people management, which I think is probably transferable across those, which is great, and definitely a skill that's required in that role, I'm sure. But yeah, that, like you said, there's just so much nuance in the digital space that it really requires an understanding almost as deep as everyone working on that team, or at least a good working knowledge of how that stuff plays out. Everything from design and inception and really working out the value of something right through to how you scale and really start building upon something once it's released. And there's just so much in the detail of all of that you really do need someone at that level to understand everything across that spectrum. And of course, we've started to move away from that really in the agile space and in the IT and digital space as well, haven't we? Where we now operate more with kind of PMO functions that are looking a bit more strategically, and certainly probably do fulfill that more traditional kind of project management role, which I think is fine at that level. And then you start to introduce people like, if you're working with Scrum, for example, Scrum Masters, who are much less dictating the project and much more just making sure that the team is focused and happy and motivated. And equally, having that two-way conversation, because a lot of the time the engineers and the designers and everyone else involved on the projects are kind of encouraged now to speak up and give feedback right through to the PMO level. And there's this big, feedback cycle that really needs to be there. And I think the other thing as well is that I agree that the project management is critical throughout all of this, especially when you consider scope. And as we said, scope, I think, is one of the biggest things that you can control to get something delivered within constraints ultimately. But you do need good project management behind that. And I think having someone who can manage that scope and push back when perhaps some of the higher levels in a company are pressuring is really key to getting results, basically.
Absolutely. And you've just touched on something there, and I just want to sort of get your thoughts. Do you think that Agile has had like a very positive effect on actually how the effectiveness of projects being delivered against their scope and to a certain budget? Or do you think that it's kind of the same? Are we seeing the same issues?
I think it's totally made an impact. Again, it's one of those things we've spoke about it a lot in the past, and I don't want to cover it too much, but when it's done well, it's fantastic, and it really is a good tool. And it isn't a complicated mindset, but it does require the whole company to be brought into that transformation. And I think what we so often see is that kind of the innovation teams or R&D teams, or even just kind of standard IT development teams, are quite happy to operate in that new way. But when you're ultimately backed by a project function that's still working in a very much waterfall and exact budget up front and sign off required and all that sort of stuff, it doesn't work so well. But I've certainly seen that there's been, there's good amounts of research to back this, that a lot more projects are now being much more successful in terms of not getting canned after those, like you said, spending millions of pounds, because they're not operating in a model, hopefully, where they're not spending tons of cash before actually testing that concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more as well. I think that where you mentioned that disconnect before, I feel like they're taking an agile approach to every project infinitely increases your chances of delivering to scope and delivering on time, and to budget as well, because again, it's taking away that level of power to a project manager that may not actually have the knowledge or the skill within the area, and it's giving that 360 feedback, if you will, like you were talking about before, and with daily meetings and sort of like I said, daily scrums, and monthly reviews and stuff like that. It works really well to try and to get the project on board and get everybody within the same place. Because of that, you can then manage time better, managing time and resource almost in an instant way every day allows you to not have any waste. And I think that that's a massive part of scope as well, especially within waterfall projects, is the amount of waste that comes out because someone spent I don't know, they've been given a task, for instance, that's going to give them 2 weeks, and maybe they've completed it in a week, but then they're just kind of slowing down. Whereas if they can complete that within a week, then it gives them an extra week to work on something else. And I think this is where, again, you'll probably find that Agile really helps actually deliver against that scope and deliver to budget.
Yeah, completely. The other thing with Agile, I think, as well, that's often missed is that testing phase, isn't it? Because the great thing about digital products, as opposed to kind of more traditional hardware products or anything else on the market, is that we have this ability to continually release updates without really much impact to the end user, which we wouldn't get when you release a new shampoo, for example. You don't have the ability to then go and tweak it and get a new version out. So I think leaning on that as much as you can. And again, if there's this real focus on what's the minimum scope we need to deliver this and test it and get it out of the door, essentially, I think that's a great thing to focus on, just to make sure that you're spending as least time as possible and the less budget as you can as well. And hopefully being able to test that the return is there. And of course, there are a bunch of ways to manage that as well, with different release plans and making sure that you have a bunch of users that you can release to first of all, if it's something specific. So there are lots of ways to manage it, but essentially aiming for that kind of drip feed approach of features, really testing the waters for something quickly and focusing on that end of the Agile spectrum is super valuable, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing you mentioned earlier as well, and it's something that does come up a lot, I think, especially at the start of projects when budget's being discussed, is how we can reduce budget. And I think one of the things that's often thrown up is, how can we just get someone to do this cheaper? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It's always the initial question, isn't it? You'll get given the initial figure, and then it's, well, how can we do that cheaper? And I think that's always going to be, with every project, you're always going to have that. It's, well, this is the initial figure. It's like if you go shopping, like for a TV, you're not going to go look at the first TV and buy that straight away because, oh, it's an all right price. You're going to go out shopping. I think the problem is that you can be too focused on that area of trying to cut costs, and that's when it can start affecting the resources that you're bringing in. It can affect that, and then ultimately it affects the scope, and it can affects what you're delivering, and that can affect the product, the end product that you're trying to build as well. So I think that it does have a knock-on effect. I mean, I'm not against going out and shopping for a better approach, basically. If you want to put it simply, cutting costs, I think it's a necessity. Obviously, there's people who do that. There's lean technicians out there whose jobs are there to go and cut and things like that. But personally, I think that there needs to only be a certain amount that you can cut down. I think there's only certain areas that you need to look into cutting down. I think that, yes, maybe you can go out and get a cheaper resource. So if you've got an original quote for a contractor who's charging you £2,000 a day, and you know that you can probably get someone in for £1,000 a day, and there's going to be very little difference in quality of the output, then yeah, maybe that's something to look at. Equally, if you can cut time down in certain areas, and like you said before, use an Agile approach, which could actually technically cut your time down, which could also cut budget, then yeah, absolutely. But it's about finding that balance, not cut too much and then be stuck in the end, because again, that's when you come back to that same old thing that we keep coming back to: projects having to loosen the purse strings and throw more and more money at it, get last minute resource in, and it can all go belly up. So I think it's about finding that balance and just understanding about what areas you can cut costs from, and that differs for every single project. I can't sit there and tell you exactly what would be the issue there. I mean, from a learning perspective, it might be the actual learning approach that you take. So instead of just going for instance, from my background, instead of just going for a piece of e-learning that's going to cost 3 months, maybe go for 3 or 4 different smaller learning modules where you can get in people who are more specialized in creating things like that. There doesn't need to be as much time in the build, but it's as an effective approach to deliver. So it's all about maybe thinking about the end product as well. So I think there's loads of different ways of doing that. I think it's just not going in and going gung-ho and kind of cutting it everywhere and then being stuck. It's just about finding that right balance.
Yeah, that was a really good conversation, actually, because I think there were lots of creative ways in there that actually you can cut budget just outside of resource, which and there certainly are a lot of ways to do that, I think. I mean, my opinion on budget really is there's obviously nuance to everything, but my black and white view on it is actually that I think so often the budget conversation comes second, and a lot of the times what we see is that companies don't really know what they want to spend, so they'll kind of shop around for the cheapest and build a case around that. Whereas I think it's really important to understand the value in what you're going to be getting back, working back from that to understand what your budget is and what you're willing to spend on this. Ultimately, if you're only going to get 10,000 back from delivering something, it's pointless spending close to 10,000 unless it's for a press piece or other pieces. But hopefully that will give you a good idea of what your budget is, and then you can work back from that as to what you can actually afford. And I think more often than not, companies really should be looking at the upper end of that to deliver something really quality. Because I think you're right, the quality of output is really hard to judge often. And thankfully, a lot of the market is driven by prices that dictate quality. So more often than not, the more you spend, the better quality you'll get, hopefully. It's not always the case, of course, but yeah, that's my kind of view on it. And, the problem I think that a lot of companies are having right now is that they don't really know what any of this costs. And so they have to go shopping, for want of a better word, to find out really what the market rates for a lot of these things are. And then again, it's just worth being wary of, very cheap costs. It's the same way, if you were getting your garden done, for example, and you're getting quotes for the same job for about 5,000, and then all of a sudden someone comes along for £200, you'd be very wary of that. In the same way, I think for software and any really, kind of digital resource, it's much the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important factor to consider. I think it's just taking a logical approach to it as well. Yeah. And you kind of covered off a question I was going to ask you, actually, just there, was about when do you think it's most important to consider budget? I mean, do you think it's early on, or do you think, you can actually go out and ideate a product first, or do you think you need to have just an idea of what you're going to do before you start thinking about budget? I mean, where do you think in the sort of project cycle, do you think the budget actually takes a front seat?
Ultimately, I think it does have to come quite early. But I would love to see more companies taking that approach of just testing the water with new ideas. And I think that kind of R&D element of companies is such a missed opportunity. And there are obviously good reasons for it in a lot of companies. A lot of companies need to be fairly established to have the extra spend just to kind of spend on new ideas. But if you can get there, I think it's a great way of testing the water. And ultimately, if you can throw something out there for a little cost and see what the value is, then that's a great way of turning your budget again. But yeah, I certainly agree as well that for a lot of products, especially when you're talking big budgets, I think it is worth potentially breaking that down and having a smaller release to begin with. Again, it's just about understanding that value. And if it's either a very big amount of value and a very big budget, I think you should be equally cautious of that and potentially break it down into something that's a bit more manageable. And, with Agile, there are easy ways to do that. You just release and get some real feedback. And it doesn't even have to be a release. I mean, you can do that with things like design thinking that we've covered from the past and developing a proof of concept and starting to understand the market that way. So there are plenty of ways to do it. But I think ultimately budget does have to come early because you almost want that to be a factor that doesn't run away. The rest, time is another one you don't want to run away with. But budget is one of those things that can really bring down a company if it's not looked at. So for me, I think it does have to still come early, but there are creative ways to approach it as well.
And especially for smaller companies as well, I think it's really important. You talk about for the larger companies having that R&D and having that sort of almost having, it's almost a nice thing to have, isn't it? That to have that R&D department where as a company you've kind of made it, but for smaller companies, to go out and actually research and create a product, yes, it's an amazing thing to do, and you would want to do it without any budget and just to kind of forget about budget and just put all your heart and soul into it. But half the time, it's not a realistic approach, and especially for a smaller company, it's very difficult. So again, it's finding that balance as to sort of getting a good idea and then actually getting that budget on board and understanding, is this actually going to give you a good return on your investment? And if it's not, then is it actually worth doing at this time? And it's something that you can just put on the backlog until your company is a bit more established and has a bit more money. I think you just have to be a bit more strategic early doors about what you're going to produce. And especially with smaller companies, it's about making good products that are kind of efficient products, if you will, that will make you the money. And then you can afford to actually go out and actually build the products that you want to build and ideate around the products that you want to ideate around.
Yeah, totally. Okay, Ollie. So I think we've kind of covered a fair bit there on how to deliver within constraints. I think my takeaway is that scope is one of the biggest things you can control, and certainly helps with the timelines and budgets as well. What are your takeaways?
I think for me, it's more around the outside influences that you don't think are having a big influence, but they are. And it's about, like you've said, within those scope, it's about understanding what you can change and what you can't change, and finding that balance. And that you can have some quick wins. So just ensuring that you're cutting in the right areas to keep to a budget, but don't cut in quality, I guess, really, more than anything else.
Yeah, totally. I think more than anything, there's just so many creative ways, aren't there, these days, with the methodologies we have, the ways of working, the way we deliver everything, just to be able to deliver in different ways and really meet those constraints. So yeah, it's never been better. Cool.
Absolutely.
Great stuff. Well, thanks everyone for listening today. As always, catch us in 2 weeks' time, and we'll have the next one ready. And in the meantime, we would absolutely love it if you could share it with a friend if you've enjoyed today's episode. And if you can go and leave us a review on iTunes as well, that really does help a lot. We thank you all for listening, of course. And we'll speak to you soon.